so many women, we have been taught that emotions are a weakness, that we have to, just punch it out, ignore how we're feeling. And then, of course, it manifests and it displays. It's like you can't get rid of the emotion. So it will manifest and it will sort of show up in other verticals in our lives. So you talk about this idea of like naming it, claiming it, taming it, and reframing it. So can we walk through those steps in terms of how we can become maybe more emotionally literate?
Absolutely. And I see this a lot in my practice that I have work with, men and women of all ages, successful and intellectual and accomplished in their lives. But sometimes there's blind spots, I have them. And even though this is my profession, when it comes to knowing ourselves, it can be hard because we're not provided emotional literacy from a young age, right? So naming it is about recognizing, number one, what is the trigger that set you off? And a lot of times it's hard because people are just powering through the day, whether it's work and family, and then it isn't until the night when their head hits the pillow that all the things that happen in the day start coming back to them. Or it manifests in the form of insomnia, or it manifests in the form of anxiety, bowel, bladder symptoms, frequent urination, IBS, headaches, clenched jaw, clenched fist, tension in the head and in the shoulders. So it's helpful to go back in your day and say every day, whether it's in the form of a journal, journaling, there's so much scientific benefit about it. 15 minutes, you can write anything you want. You can keep a worry diary and we'll get into that. But being able to know the antecedent to the thing that made you feel this way, because a lot of times people will come in and they say, I'm feeling depressed and anxious. And then we really need to unpack it because maybe the more immediate cause is obvious. I lost my job. I had a breakup. But then we see that it's a series of things. So the more granular you can get, we know that people who are very granular, even when they've had suicide attempts, but if it was connected to a trigger, somehow we think that that's healthier because we're like, oh, if this was a problem that caused this really low thinking, and if we can fix the problem or change the way we relate to it, which is what we talk about in reframing, we can have great success. So naming the trigger, then claiming it. Where in your body do you feel it? Where is it causing you pain and disturbance? How is it manifesting? Taming it by writing in the journal, doing a 2-minute meditation if that's all you have time for. And it has to be on a regular basis because a lot of times patients will say, I did your meditation, it's not working. And I'm like, okay, well, if your anxiety is a 9 out of a 10, 10 being the worst, it's not helping you there. It's more of a preventative measure. For sometimes it's people under guidance, under prescription, maybe taking medication. Medication's not for everybody. There's a lot of side effects, a lot of risks and benefits that need to be weighed. So taming it is like the meat of, I give people tons of samples of ways to calm it, to calm the acute inflammation. And then in time, I'm not saying in the midst of a crisis, you're going to be able to access the reframing. But as someone who worked with people of not just 9/11 trauma, but all kind of trauma, I realized that the reframing, that is where all the money's at. If I was going to say the one thing you can learn to do, and I learned this in my own therapy, is can you create some objective space, some neutral space between you and the event? And in time say, all right, this was a really, really crappy situation. Was there any silver lining? How am I going to feel about this 5 years from now? What would I tell a friend? Was there any benefit at all to this situation? What have I learned? And if you can't do that, even just asking yourself, all right, what is the utility in me harboring this anger, this resentment? So when you can find nothing else, no benefit, okay, but then what is the harm of holding on to the negative emotion? So these are 4 naming, claiming, taming, reframing, simple things that I want people to start using immediately. And even just practicing with something that's like very low stakes. Someone didn't return your phone call. Okay, not the biggest thing in the world, but that's the perfect time to start practicing it.
Yeah. And I think some of these questions, when these self-directed questions also can force us or redirect us to slow down a little bit because the brain, at least I can say, at least my brain wants to go to, oh, it's the worst thing ever. My husband, no longer loves me. I'm no longer, a worthy doctor. Nobody wants to listen to me anymore. I go to sort of these extremes sometimes. And I think that these questions, what is the utility here? Where is it in my body? Where's the silver lining? Some of these things, just the slowing down in trying to answer that, maybe it's just enough to bring that prefrontal cortex back online because we can just tend to be very limbic, right? It's just very like, well, I guess I'm the worst and I guess everyone's going to leave me and everyone has seen that I'm a fraud and there we go.
Totally. Absolutely. And, sometimes for somebody, it might even be when you talk about slowing down, like distraction and going for a walk. And I'm a big believer, like I have found that like in very busy days or stressful days, making that a non-negotiable, because the idea of optic flow, like when you're walking, you have to look left and right, and at least in like urban areas that you don't get hit by a car, but it takes you outside of your own head in
Right.
terms of the rumination, because you can't really do the rumination and the walking at the same time unless you're like alone. But even then, you're taken outside of your head. And so the default mode network, which is always just on overdrive, and when you're not doing a task, you're perseverating and you're ruminating. And we know that there's a very strong link between rumination and depression and pessimism, and in rare cases, even suicide. So that's like the super dark side of it. But in general, you do not want to allow yourself, I think, to ruminate or fester beyond, there's no number on it, but for me, I think like 15 to 20 minutes. And if you're on this cycle and you're having a loop, obviously, if it's severe, you want to do this under the guidance of a therapist to say, what do I do to break that cycle? For some people, it's, putting cold ice on their neck, a pack. It might be submerging their face, their wrists, their neck, exposing it. And that invokes the parasympathetic nervous system, which then lowers your heart rate. Because that's what sometimes this is about, is just the autonomic, the sympathetic overdrive of go, 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 or immediately going, getting very triggered very easily. And even if it's not the big T of trauma, like life-threatening, the small T is all the small disappointments and losses that they stack up. So it's important. It's kind of like the way you clean. You clean your car, you get your car detailed, you may invest in routine cleaning of your home. I think of a lot of this as a cleaning and a maintenance, if you will.
Yeah. And it, like, you were saying, it's a skill. So it's not necessarily going to come naturally to us, which is where the utility of a book like this in terms of teaching us how to identify our emotions, naming, and then eventually reframing it can be very useful.